Hello everyone, welcome back to the War Zone. I'm Scruffy and this is Scruffy Tales. And in this video I figured I would explore why would Russia ever invade Sweden in this modern day and age, and how could Russia invade Sweden? And I think a lot of Swedes out there have been discussing this at the coffee breaks and what have you, considering that the government and the military has of late uh, warned Swedish citizens that war could indeed happen in Sweden. So, with everything's going on, I figured why not take a look at this topic. So, here we go, the video, Invasion 2032. So, why would Russia invade Sweden? It basically comes down to the fact that Russia controls the piece of land known as Kaliningrad. Once Sweden joins NATO, the Baltic Sea will become a NATO lake. This will isolate Kaliningrad, and from the Russian perspective, it will be surrounded and cut off by hostile nations. However, if Russia were to control the Swedish island of Gotland, it would give Russia control of the Baltic Sea, and Russian capabilities to defend Kaliningrad would significantly increase. And from Gotland, Russia would be able to threaten all of northern Europe with long-range missiles. Russia could build large bases for its navy and also deploy a powerful air force presence to the island. Additionally, right outside of Gotland, we have the two Nord Stream pipelines, one of three pipelines that Russia relies upon to sell gas to Europe. Of course, the Nord Stream pipelines were famously sabotaged on the 26th of September of 2022 and cut Russian gas supplies to Germany. If Russia grabs Gotland, it also offers security in the Baltic for Russian interests, safeguarding the pipelines and trade routes that are vital for Russia. Here we see the range of a SAM system and a ballistic missile system, if they are positioned on Gotland. As you can see, if Russia controls Gotland, then Gotland can be fortified and be used as a launch platform for missiles as well as aircraft to deal with Sweden once Sweden has joined NATO and any NATO forces deployed to the Nordic Kingdom. Also, if we take a look at the range of the Russian SAM systems with missiles at Kaliningrad and on Gotland, all of a sudden the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, are surrounded and cut off, providing Russia with a real strategic advantage against the three small Baltic countries. So how soon can Russia invade? Well, Russia is in no position at the moment to threaten Sweden militarily. Two criteria must be met before Russia can reasonably begin thinking about starting an armed conflict with Sweden. Peace in Ukraine, and Russia must rebuild and modernize its military. First of all, there must be peace in Ukraine. As long as Russia is caught up in this devastating conflict, Russia cannot reasonably threaten Sweden, as the Ukrainians will drain Russian resources in the shape of manpower, fuel, ammunition, equipment and vehicles, etc. If Russia ever achieves peace with Ukraine, then Russia needs to rebuild its military to replace all the tanks and armored transports that they've lost, along with artillery, missiles, and so on. The army will start recruiting and rebuild, now with officers and NCOs with hard-earned experience from the war with Ukraine, ready to train and lead the new recruits. Many European think tanks speculate that Russia will need 3 to 10 years of rebuilding before it can be a threat to another European country. So how would Russia do it? The invasion of Sweden will be a drawn-out affair beginning with small-scale operations and then slowly over several years grow in scale and complexity. Every step along the way carefully thought out to support the final stage of the plans: invasion. How could Russia invade Sweden? Well, we will rely on a fictional series of events, more or less realistic, at the very least somewhat plausible, on what leads up to Russia setting plans into motion to invade Sweden and how they could, potentially, go about it all. In 2025, peace is finally achieved between Ukraine and Russia. As Ukraine begins to rebuild its war-torn nation, Russia instead begins to rebuild its armed forces, the country now almost entirely focused on a military buildup. It will be around 2030 that Russia has rebuilt its army, air force and navy to be considered a threat to its closest neighbors, both in Asia and in Europe. After the war in Ukraine, a war Russia could have won had not Western nations provided military aid to Ukraine, tensions between Europe and Russia intensifies. Even more so after Moldova is allowed into the EU in 2027. Partisan activities funded by Russia in the Donbas region of Ukraine makes it impossible for Ukraine to join NATO, as a requirement to join the defense alliance is stability within the country. But when the EU begins to make moves in 2028 to allow Ukraine into the European Union, Russia calls it an active act of aggression against the Russian sphere of influence, the straw that broke the camel's back. Meanwhile, Hungary keeps stalling in the EU to help Ukraine rebuild, and also is still stalling to allow Sweden into NATO even by 2028, together with Turkey. The Russian-funded terrorists in the Donbas has the world continue their sanctions on Russia. Russia calls it Russophobia and an outrage that Russia is accused of funding terrorism. According to Russian media, the terrorists in the Donbas are freedom fighters fighting Ukrainian oppression. With tensions running high ever since the end of the Ukraine war in 2025, Russia accuses the West, the EU and NATO for warmongering and discrimination of Russians and Russian businesses. With the Russian military having regained its strength and capacity to strike abroad by 2030, Russia knows that it is now or never if they are to gain a strategic upper hand in the north of Europe. Sweden is still not in NATO, but the window of opportunity is closing. If Russia manages to grab the island of Gotland before Sweden becomes a member of NATO, Russia could then fortify the island and use it as a counterweight to the heavy NATO presence in and around the Baltic Sea. The psychological operation aimed at Sweden with intent to set the stage for the eventual invasion begins long before the armed forces are ready. In fact, these operations started while the war with Ukraine was still ongoing. Russia sets out to disrupt Swedish society in various ways. Rumors and lies about events in Sweden are spread on social media. Russia especially targets news, events and rumors concerning immigrants, crime, and when society has failed ordinary Swedes. Russia even pays individuals to perform outrageous acts to stir up emotions and to set groups within Swedish society against each other. Meanwhile, from 2029 and forward, Russia focuses on strengthening its presence in the Baltic. The Russian fleet at Kaliningrad is reinforced, as is the Air Force units located there. Paratroop and amphibious regiments are strengthened, and most of the Ukraine veterans are reassigned to these companies. Sweden responds by further increasing its military spending, expanding conscription, and in media, Swedish government and military officials urge citizens to be ready for a crisis where they must be able to survive without food or water for at least a week. Russian officials calls it all nonsense and Russophobia, And in Russian state-controlled television, we now begin to see segments where Russia accuses Sweden of being openly hostile against Russia. TV hosts begin to talk about the need to defend Russian territory from Swedish aggression, calling Sweden a pawn of NATO. In Sweden, people begin to follow every step detailed in the government-issued brochure If War or Crisis Comes, a small booklet detailing the essentials on how citizens can prepare for surviving without electricity and water supply, and what food and rations they have stockpiled at home. It also details what to expect and how to act if the country is faced with war. Perhaps most importantly of all, it highlights the very core for Sweden's defense policy in case of war. If Sweden is attacked by another country, we will never surrender. Any information that resistance shall end is false. In other words, no government, no political leader, no military leader, not even the king himself, can order Swedish soldiers or citizens to surrender, to accept a ceasefire, as long as Swedish territory is occupied by enemy forces or under threat by foreign aggression. By 2030, Russian rhetoric towards Sweden escalates. A media campaign within Russia spreads on television, radio, and social media, showing images and quotes that paints famous Swedes as either Russophobic, fascists, or supporters of neo-Nazis, just like we saw Russia do in early 2022, but now on a grander national scale. Sweden's racial studies of the 1930s are highlighted as evidence of Sweden's Nazi tendencies. Sweden's forced sterilization of homosexuals, among others, well into the 1970s is also used for this purpose. With the Social Democratic Party, Sweden's largest political party, being strongly linked to these events, the Social Democrats in Sweden are said to have a strong neo-Nazi past. And the fact that the Sweden Democrats, Sweden's second largest party after 2025, were founded by a former SS soldier is repeated over and over in Russian news. This is very often combined with images of a Sweden Democrat Party member exclaiming on live Swedish television, Hell Seger, after a successful election. Hell Seger, translated from Swedish to German, is Sieg Heil. Russia has now begun a propaganda campaign to prepare its citizens for another war, a righteous war against a fascist neo-Nazi threat that is once more supported by the sinister and evil NATO. At the same time as Sweden is being portrayed as a neo-Nazi fascist nation, Russia also ridicules the Swedish military for being soft and unprepared for war. Sweden's acceptance of various sexual minorities is mocked and even blamed for a lot of the troubles the country has suffered between 1990 and 2030. They remark that Sweden of 2030 is not a dangerous lion like it was in 1709 when Russia destroyed the Swedish army at Poltava. If Russia could defeat Sweden at Poltava when it was a strong superpower, surely Russia would have no problem with Sweden being a weak and soft Western country. And if Sweden is not careful, Russia will be forced to repeat the actions of 1809 when Russia took Finland, a third of the Swedish kingdom, from the Swedish king. With mounting Russian aggression, submarines violating Swedish waters, Russian fighter jets flying dangerously close to Swedish civilian aircraft, as well as the vessels of the Swedish Navy and fighters of the Swedish Air Force, together with a steady increase of Russian rhetoric aimed at accusing Sweden of threatening Russia and being a hostile power in the Baltic region that is nothing but a pawn of NATO in an attempt to harm Russia and destroy the great Russian people, Sweden has no choice but to ramp up its military spending between 2030 and 2032, which is reported in Russian media as proof of Sweden's intentions of provoking Russia. But with all the unruly feelings and situations all across Sweden, with riots, increasing violent crimes, people openly questioning the system, people voicing opinions to leave the EU, to not enter NATO, to not provoke a confrontation with Russia, it is not without issues that Sweden tries to get its people and military ready for a potential conflict. People refuse to go through with conscription, to do repetition training with the army, and online voices argue that they do not owe the country anything and that they should not have to be forced to fight a war that could be avoided with diplomacy. A free and peace-loving, naive nation is under threat, and everything is about to fall apart without a single shot fired. Between 2030 and 2032, Sweden suffers an increase in cyber attacks. Large areas of the country lose electrical power for periods of time. The water supply becomes contaminated with bacteria. Issues with the internet become more and more frequent. Phone services become increasingly unreliable. Riots become more frequent in low-income areas, especially where there is a large population of immigrants, all fueled by nefarious actors stoking the flames of rage on behalf of Moscow. Mysterious drones are popping up all over the country nearby vital installations for national defense or for civil services dealing with disasters and crises, as well as power plants, railroad hubs, and information junctions. In 2031, the Swedish Home Guard is called in on regular basis to assist in safeguarding military installations. Security companies are ordered by the government and the police to assist in guarding vital civilian locations. The Swedish military is almost on a weekly basis looking for mysterious sonar contacts within Swedish waters that could be foreign submarines. And Swedish newspapers report every other month of rumored operations that include both the military and the police trying to chase down and arrest potential spies, saboteurs, and even hostile special forces operating on Swedish soil. Tension and hostilities is about to reach a climax. Sweden has some 120,000 troops available by 2032, a mixture of career soldiers, conscripts between 18 and 25, and ordinary citizens in their 30s who have been called in to serve, having received papers years before telling them that they have a war placement. And in case of war, they will follow orders and join the unit they have been assigned to. These are ordinary citizens who in their youth did their service as conscripts, or they will fill a vital role within society that demands that they perform that task no matter what, despite a war going on. Should casualties begin to mount and new recruits are needed, another 100,000 people stand ready to be called in to fight. Some are former conscripts, others are young and able who have not done military service. In fact, some of them have already been called in to start a 3-month crash course on how to become a soldier. Every one of them ready to do what is needed of them, should the unthinkable happen. During the spring of 2032, Russia gathers a huge military force in the Baltic region to conduct the impressive exercise Zapad 32. The American CIA and British MI6 warned Sweden that Russia has brought out a massively enormous blood supply to support the exercise. Exactly what they did before invading Ukraine. Blood needed to treat wounded soldiers who have been wounded in combat. Sweden deploys its Navy and Air Force to keep a close eye on the exercise. During the months as Russia is moving its forces into position, the EU and NATO provide Sweden with weapons and ammunition. Everything points to Russia launching an invasion. Then, a Russian cruiser patrolling close to Swedish waters suffers a great explosion and 4 sailors dies and another 12 are wounded. A Russian red flag operation, simulating that their own ship has been attacked. Russia is quick to accuse Sweden of opening fire on the Russian vessel, something Sweden denies as strongly as possible. Moscow gives the order to all of its forces at Kaliningrad: attack. With all pieces in place, Russia is ready to launch its invasion. On the morning of the invasion, before any Russian ships or aircraft make a move towards Sweden, all across the country vital installations are attacked and sabotage is conducted against electric power, against drinking water, against bridges, railroads and information hubs, as well as telecommunication masts and junctions. The Home Guard, police and security companies arrest saboteurs, chase suspected foreign agents, and even in some cases get involved in firefights with Russian operators. Kamikaze drones strike government buildings, police stations, fire departments, and even hospitals. Several politicians, police officers, military personnel, fighter pilots, the list goes on, are assassinated in ambushes or murdered in their homes. Then a storm of missiles fly in over Gotland and the south of Sweden. Chaos spreads across the country. Panic sets in. Russia's main goal has from the start been to gain control of Gotland. The entire operation, from start to finish, is all about Gotland. Russia's problem is that Sweden is fully capable of defending Gotland. Sweden has enough ships, enough fighter jets, enough tanks, and enough soldiers to successfully defend the island. So what Russia has to do is force Sweden to spread those forces thin along multiple fronts, forcing Sweden to allocate vital resources away from Gotland. Therefore, it was planned that a large force would be moving from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad to take part in the large military exercise, just as the war starts, to be in a position to strike the Swedes from the east. As panic sets in all across Sweden, Russian forces steam for Swedish shores. Task Force Blue heads straight for Stockholm. Its mission is to seize the capital. Task Force Yellow is heading for Norrköping. The old strategic target in the Soviet invasion plans had the Cold War turned hot. Task Force Red has one mission: occupy Gotland, attack it from the south and north at the same time. Task Force Green is to secure Öland Island, to draw Swedish forces away from other engagements, and to support Task Force Purple, who is assigned to destroy the Navy base at the Swedish town of Karlskrona. The attack on Stockholm fails, as the Swedish Navy and Air Force prioritize striking at this threat. After 2 to 3 days, Task Force Blue instead supports the efforts of Task Force Yellow. Norrköping falls after 3 days of hard fighting. The Russians going for the town of Visby, located on the northern side of Gotland, are sunk at sea by Swedish anti-ship missiles and tanks and IFVs that act as mobile coastal artillery. But to the south, Russia establishes a foothold and starts pushing north on the island. The attempt to secure Öland is a massive failure, as Swedish troops manage to wipe out this Russian contingent within 24 hours. Sadly, Karlskrona is completely bombed into ruins in a massive missile strike. The base is completely destroyed and the town itself suffers horrendous civilian casualties. Russia keeps advancing on Gotland. It is difficult for Sweden to supply its forces on the island. At the same time, Swedish submarines and aircraft are sinking multiple Russian transport ships trying to reach Gotland as well as Norrköping. At Norrköping, Russian forces expand their control around the city despite stiff Swedish resistance, and begin to slowly push north in an attempt to isolate the Swedish capital of Stockholm. Another assault is launched in the south. This time, Task Force Green tries to land troops east of Karlskrona, combined with another try to occupy Öland. The war has now raged for a week. Can Sweden really win? Supporting Gotland will not be easy if it is attacked. It is not unreasonable that Russia will try to prevent this by launching attacks on the Swedish mainland. Missiles, bombs and drones will strike targets all across Sweden to disrupt electricity, water supply and communications. Cities and towns will be hit as well. Civilians will be targeted in terror bombings. The only way Sweden can win, the only way Sweden can prevent any of this from happening, is if all Swedish citizens are prepared to do their part. It is every citizen's duty between the ages of 16 and 70 to actively help in the defense of the country. Not everyone has to fight, but everyone needs to do something, because that is our only chance to win, our only chance to keep this from happening at all. If we are prepared now today, if we are ready, then we are stronger the day the unthinkable happens. If most of us can support ourselves, we can let the government and military help those who really needs help. And if we all stand united and ready to defend our children from occupation and oppression, then even Russia will understand that this is a fight they cannot win. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it interesting. I will probably do a follow-up video taking a look at the battles being fought and why Sweden and Russia are successful at various parts of the conflict in this fictional series of events. I hope you will all return to take a look at it once it's ready. If you are interested in what an engagement at sea between Sweden and Russia might look like in my fictional scenario, I suggest you click the links in the description to two videos made by the Grim Reapers channel. I highly recommend these videos, so please check them out. It's two videos detailing simulated combat between Sweden and Russia, and it's intense as hell. So please check them out. And well, that's all I have for you. I'll see you in the next one, and Russia will remember that Swedish steel cuts deep.